Okay, so anyway, I'm here today with Fred Litwin, who is an author of 2 books. He just finished one of here recently, which I've got a copy of. Still haven't got into it yet. I apologize that, but it was where I kind of cut my teeth on the Kennedy assassination after watching Oliver Stone's movie and learning about the Clay Bertrand and being involved in it. Fred, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and touch on your books and tell everybody about your blog and of course tell them where they can find them at too.
Well, I've been following the JFK assassination since 1975 when I saw the Zapruder film on the Geraldo Rivera show, and I had to figure out what was going on, and that set me on a path to corresponding with people like Cyril Wecht and Harold Weisberg. And eventually led me many years later in the 90s to Gerald Posner and realizing that there was no conspiracy. And I've written 2 books on the assassination. The first book was I Was a Teenage JFK Conspiracy Freak, which is sort of a memoir which tells why I changed my thinking in the JFK assassination. And my current book, which is On the Trail of Delusion, Jim Garrison, the Great Accuser, which goes over Jim Garrison and one of the greatest miscarriages of American jurisprudence in his prosecution of Clay Shaw.
Subtitles on. Okay, sorry. Sorry about that. Okay, so I just want to briefly touch on that first book. That was kind of like a book explaining your whole metamorphosis from being the conspiracy and that right there. Okay, I think that'd be a very interesting book for a lot of us. Especially I need to get that one too, especially like me, because I went from being hardcore conspiracy theorist to now changed a lot of my views. So, what got you involved or interested in the Shaw trial? What caught your attention to that?
Well, I actually was kind of lucky when I first started going to the library back in the 70s to look at the assassination. One of the few books in the library in Montreal was American Grotesque by James Kirkwood. And he had been to the trial, he attended the trial, and he wrote this pretty massive, almost 600-page book on what happened to Clay Shaw. And I read the book, and it's a very good read. It's a very interesting book. And so right from the start, even though I thought there was a conspiracy, I really was aware that Jim Garrison was a fraud, and the whole Clay Shaw investigation was nothing. So
did you know of the investigation before that book, or?
I'm sorry, what?
Did you already know of the trial and investigation before that book, or?
No, I had never heard of anything until I sort of picked up that book and read it, and I said, "Wow, it's a very interesting story. Nobody knows this." And so I realized I had to put a couple of chapters in my first book about Jim Garrison, because it ultimately led to Oliver Stone in his film JFK, because he made Jim Garrison the hero of his film. So I put that in. But what really got me going on Jim Garrison was that one of the critics, James Giorginio, wrote in a review of my first book, he said, well, Litwin really hasn't gone through the primary Garrison documents. He has not reviewed the papers of Jim Garrison. And he was right, I hadn't. And at the same time that he said that, somebody on one of the JFK email lists I'm on posted a link to the National Archives, which has digitized all of Jim Garrison's papers. So I started going through his papers, and slowly but surely I kept on coming across what I would call crazy memos to and from Garrison that are just really ridiculous. And I started putting them aside one by one, and by the time I got up to 30 and 40 crazy memos, I started to think maybe there's a book here. Maybe this guy is actually worse than I thought. And that's what started me on the trek to write about Jim Garrison.
Okay, so first question for our viewers here: was Clay Shaw guilty?
No, Clay Shaw was completely innocent. He had nothing to do with the assassination of JFK.
Did Clay Shaw ever use the name Bertrand?
No. So Clay Shaw, there's no evidence that he used the name Bertrand. As he would say himself, he was very well known in New Orleans. He stood out because he was 6 feet 4 inches tall. He was quite distinguished looking. He was on TV all the time. It would have been somewhat difficult for him to use a pseudonym, being so well known in New Orleans.
Yeah, and I think if I'm not mistaken, New Orleans was around 100,000 people in the 1960 census.
Yeah, I'm sure it was pretty. It was pretty tiny, and I think he even lives in a tinier world because most of his world was the French Quarter.
Yeah, it would be very, very hard to notice that.
Yeah.
Any chance he could have used that alias Bertrand out of town, hiding it up?
Well, it's always possible. There's just no evidence that he did. Nobody really knew him by that name. The few people at Garrison could come up with those really poor witnesses. So there's no evidence. And also, I should say, Clay Shaw, after a while, he didn't do all that much traveling. He didn't like to fly. So Clay Shaw was limited to driving and train and stuff. And that's one of the reasons why he never attended a board meeting of Permandex CMC, the organization in Rome that he was a part of. He just wouldn't fly over to Europe.
Was that a CIA front?
Permandex CMC was rumored to be a CIA front. A communist-controlled newspaper in Rome, Paese Sera, wrote a series of articles after Clay Shaw's arrest, claiming that Permandex CMC was a CIA front, but in fact it was just a real estate venture. They wanted to build the World Trade Center in Rome. Because of the new European community, they thought it would be a good idea to make Rome a trading hub. It was a great idea. They got some very cheap land and some cheap buildings, but they never got enough tenants and enough financing, and the whole thing collapsed in 1962, and it was nothing more than a failed real estate venture.
Okay, so before we get too far ahead of everything, let's start with the assassination takes place. And Dean Andrews gets a phone call that Clay Bertrand wants him to go to Dallas and rep Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yeah, so this is one of the early stories. On Saturday, November 23rd, Dean Andrews was this sort of overweight municipal lawyer in New Orleans, and he was in the hospital for double pneumonia. He was very, very heavily sedated, and he claimed that on Saturday night he got a phone call from a Mr. Clay Bertrand, who was somebody who would bring him gay clients to represent in municipal court, called him to say, would he go to Dallas and represent Lee Harvey Oswald? And so that was his story. And he told that story to the FBI and Secret Service, and they investigated. They could find no evidence that he was contacted by Mr. Clay Bertrand. There was no evidence in his files of a Clay Bertrand at all. And he basically admitted to the FBI that it was all a figment of his imagination. But lo and behold, he actually went before the Warren Commission and told them the same story.
So where did the name come from? Is it when he's sedated, it just popped out of his mind or something? Or, I'd read that he went to Gene Davis, went by the name Clay Bertrand, a bartender in the French Quarter.
Yeah, Gene Davis was a gay man in New Orleans who also ended up owning a gay bar in New Orleans. And he sometimes sent clients to Dean Andrews. They knew each other quite well. So there's a couple of pieces of evidence that perhaps Clay Bertrand was a term that was used to talk about gay people in trouble. And that's how they would communicate, using the name Clay Bertrand.
So let's step back into 1960 eyes. That was more of a way to kind of protect people's identity.
Yeah, it was sort of like, okay, tell them Clay Bertrand sent you. But it wasn't really an alias of Gene Davis, but he may have used that as a term to signify to gay people who were in trouble, use this name Clay Bertrand.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so they are walking. I didn't finish that with the Warren Commission. All right, so Dean Andrews still said that in the Warren Commission. Now, in his original statement, didn't he describe him as like 5'8" with sandy blonde hair and a lot younger?
Yeah, he was like
than
early 20s, 5'8", blonde hair, sort of a very young boyish type. That was his first description of Clay Bertrand. Then before the Warren Commission, it changed completely. And I think it reflected the fact that if you look at Dean Andrews, you look at all of his statements over the years, his descriptions of Clay Bertrand changed all the time. I even have a statement from him that he made to Clay Shaw's investigators that Clay Bertrand was a married man with 4 children, et cetera, et cetera. So it was always changing. And I think again, it reflected the personality of Dean Andrews and the fact that there really was no actual person by the name of Clay Bertrand.
And I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think before Andrews died, he actually changed his story back again. I don't remember exactly what he changed it to, but I remember reading something he changed right before he died. He changed it. It gave it a whole nother account of
well, he actually, if you read his, for one thing, he was always clear it was not Clay Shaw. So he always said that. In fact, he testified for the defense of Clay Shaw at the trial. And you should read his testimony in the trial, because he basically admits in the trial that he made it all up. There was quite a bit of laughter in the court when he testified. He was a bit embarrassed about some of the whole thing about Clay Bertrand. But he was always clear it was not Clay Shaw.
I'll hold off this question right here later. Okay, so the assassination takes place. Guy Bannister, Jack Martin. We also in the Oliver Stone movie, they're drinking in the bar, and they go back to his office, and he pistol whips him over going through some files. Is that what happened, or did something else?
Well, that's a good question, but I think there was a police report that night. After the pistol whipping, Jack Martin went to the hospital, then he went home, called the police, and the police came over, and he said it was a fight. It was a discussion about unauthorized long-distance phone calls. And that's what he told the police, and in fact, that's what he told Harold Weisberg privately. In fact, I have got 2 memos from Harold Weisberg where he says, this is what Jack Martin told me privately. So I think the whole scene in the movie, in Oliver Stone's movie, was made up, but he was pistol whipped, but it was probably over phone calls.
Now, is Jack Martin, is he the one that made the phone call and said that Ferry was going to fly Oswald out of the country? Is that how Ferry got involved in
Jack
this?
Martin was a former felon. His real name was Edward Suggs. He was a former felon. He had been wanted for murder in Texas. He was a real lowlife, a psychopath. He was a nut. And he had a grudge. He was in and out of Guy Bannister's office. And I think one day David Ferry threw him out, and he held a grudge against David Ferry. And that weekend of the assassination, he knew that Ferry was head of the Civil Air Patrol troop in New Orleans. And he basically surmised, well, Oswald was in Cap 2 for a while, and maybe they knew each other. And so Jack Martin called everybody he knew, the FBI, the New Orleans police, the FAA, about his information on David Ferry. And he told a whole variety of stories about David Ferry to try and get David Ferry in trouble, which it did. But basically, even Jack Martin had to admit to the FBI that when he gets drunk, which he often was, he suffers from a disease called telephonitis.
I've had that problem once or twice. Okay, so now we've linked.
So Ferry was brought in for questioning. I mean, Ferry was brought in for questioning. It was all on the basis of Jack Martin, and of course, Ferry, that weekend of the assassination, was in Houston. He went ice skating with 2 of his buddies. And they quickly figured out that was true.
And for a lot of people, you told me this the other day, and a lot of people didn't know this. clarify again. He did go to the ice skating, but he went with a friend who was a world class skater, or
Well,
something like that.
he went with two young friends, Alba Buff and Mel Coffey. Alba Buff was actually almost a world class roller skater. He was a big roller skater. He had never gone ice skating. He wanted to go ice skating. There were no ice skating rinks in New Orleans, and they found out there was an ice skating rink in Houston. And so that weekend, after the Kennedy was assassinated, that afternoon, uh, basically David Ferry won the court case. He was in court on a Carlos Marcello case, and they won around 3:20. And he decided that night they would drive to Houston for fun, and go ice skating. And so it was a big thing for Alba Buff to finally get an ice skating rink.
Was Ferry actually going? I read where he was actually looking at investing in one. He came in some money or something, and
yeah, well, he was for a little bit. Well, he had some money from the Carlos Marcello case. He had also gotten some money from Eastern Airlines from his termination, and so he was looking into buying an ice skating rink. And in fact, there was an ad in the New Orleans Times-Picayune of somebody who was looking for an investor for an ice skating rink. So he was interested in talking to the guy who managed the ice skating rink in Houston about the cost and the cost structure, et cetera, et cetera. It was definitely a possibility. Never panned out, though.
Something I'd like to point out, I can't remember off the top of my head geographical-wise. Houston's like 2.5 or 3 hours away from Dallas. Is that right? Or 2 hours away? Yeah, from Houston to Dallas.
Yeah, it's something like that. I'm not sure exactly how long it is.
But it's not. It's not like going up the street. So just for the people who are listening, if you are Dave Ferry and you're going to fly Oswald out of the country, do you be 2 hours away with two people that can tie you to him?
Well, the fact that he was the getaway, you send the getaway pilot to a city hours and hours away. I mean,
with
just
two people,
and even Garrison realized after a while. I mean, he knew that Ferry was not in Dallas, and does it really make sense to have the getaway pilot with two buddies? In fact, by the way, besides going ice skating, Ferry also did some business. On the way back, they stopped in a small town in Louisiana to visit a client of Ray Gill, who was the lawyer he was working for. He had to do some business as well.
Would you say it's safe to say that, as far as that investigation goes, that I've read, even the Texas Rangers investigated that Ferry was probably the most investigated person trying to tie him to that assassination. I read where the Texas Rangers investigated his movements in that day and could find nothing to tie Dave Ferry to the Kennedy assassination at all.
Yeah, well, there was nothing to find. I mean, his story was really true. And in fact, I spoke to Alba Buff. Alba Buff is still alive. He's in his 70s, lives in Louisiana. We spoke for around an hour, and he told me, they went ice skating. He always wanted to go ice skating. He still thinks very highly of David Ferry. David Ferry was actually the kind of guy that if you were in a parking lot and you had a flat tire and it was raining, he would go outside and help you. He was a very smart guy. He spoke multiple languages, played the piano. He was a very, very knowledgeable guy, and he wanted to help people.
Okay, so any chance that Shaw and Ferry knew each other?
Well, there's always the possibility they might have seen each other in New Orleans. It was, as you say, it was a pretty small place. And the gay community itself within New Orleans, within the French Quarter, was probably not that big. And so, it's not, look, you can go to a gay bar and you could see somebody over and over again. You may not know them, but you sort of like, okay, I know I've seen them. So it's possible their paths crossed at parties or in gay bars, but I don't think they knew each other because they both denied knowing each other, and none of their friends ever saw them together. So they didn't know each other in the way of as a friend. So I don't, I think that there wasn't much to the fact about them knowing each other. Okay.
That makes perfect a great answer right
They
there.
they also ran in different social circles. I mean, Clay
That
Shaw
was something else I was on
hanging out with
wanted to
Nancy
ask.
Williams and other people, so they were slightly different in the social circles.
Yeah, they just seem to me like two. I don't want to. Two totally different people with who they would run with.
Yeah, and also David
Okay.
Ferrie had his supply of. He was very, very heavily involved with Civil Air Patrol and running after boys that way. I don't know how much time he hung out in gay bars.
Did I can't remember if I should start right. Did Ferry know Bannister?
Yes, he did.
Okay.
They were involved in the anti-Castro Cuban cause in 1961. In the very early 60s, they worked together. So yes, Ferry did know Guy Bannister.
Okay, so we've got Ferry and did Shaw? Did he know Guy Bannister?
I don't think so. I don't think Shaw knew Guy Bannister. And I should say something about David Ferry was that he was very actively involved in the anti-Castro Cuban activities in New Orleans in the early 60s, but he stopped because he was terminated by Eastern Airlines. And once he was terminated by Eastern Airlines, he stopped his activities with the anti-Castro Cubans. He really focused his attention on getting reinstated. And there's a lot of work to get reinstated. And so people who think that in 1963 Ferry was involved with the anti-Castro Cuban movement, that's not true at all. He was really working to get himself reinstated.
Was he involved in, because there's a scene in the movie, was he involved in Operation Mongoose?
I don't think so. I think I think he was more involved. He was involved. I mean, first off, you have to understand with David Ferry that he there was a lot of talking with the guy. So he wanted to impress a lot of the boys around town, so he would tell them tales of his trips to Cuba and the battle scars that he had. There wasn't that much truth to it, but he was involved with Sergio Arcacha Smith and the Cuban Revolutionary Front and Guy Bannister in 1961 in the anti-Castro Cuban cause.
All right, so now let's get into part of it. Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yeah,
he had the stamp on his Fair Play for Cuba leaflets. So, did he know Guy Bannister?
I don't think he did. And by the way, his stamp of 544 Camp Street was not on the leaflets he was handing out. It was on a couple of pamphlets.
I'm sorry.
The Fair Play for Cuba Committee. I don't think he knew Guy Bannister. There's no actual evidence that he did. The only evidence that's really come forward about that comes from Delphine Roberts, who was Guy Bannister's secretary, but she never said that initially. She was interviewed by Jim Garrison in 1967, and she said nothing about Lee Harvey Oswald being in the office. Absolutely nothing. She only said that years later to Anthony Summers and then to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And I don't think she was a reliable witness.
And for a lot of people don't know, the building had separate entrances.
Yeah, so there was 540 Camp Street. It was the corner of Camp and Lafayette. And so Guy Bannister's office was on the Lafayette side. 544 Camp Street led upstairs to where the Sergio Arcacha Smith, for a brief period of time, had his Cuban Revolutionary Front offices.
Oh, and one thing, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, how many members was involved in that?
Just one. There was Lee Harvey Oswald. He was the only member, and
yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. It's just he was the only member. I think I think it's interesting to know what was Lee Harvey Oswald doing. I mean, I think what Oswald was really trying to do with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and his interactions with Carlos Bringuier, who was
I've always wondered about that.
I thought he was trying to put together sort of a resume, a portfolio that he could show the Cubans in Mexico City. He wanted to go to Cuba, and so he really knew he wanted to bring some sort of portfolio of material that he could show them about how dedicated he was to the Cuban cause.
Okay, so now question. We've all seen in the movie where Oswald's handing out the leaflets and from the backs, the mysterious Clay Bertrand, Clay Shaw. Did Clay Shaw know Lee Harvey Oswald?
No, I don't think he did, and there's no evidence that he did. Absolutely none. And don't forget, Lee Harvey Oswald only lived in New Orleans for 5 months. He was there for 5 months. He lived with Marina. They lived together. He didn't really do much at night. He was always there most nights at home. I don't think that they knew each other. The only evidence that they were ever together was the evidence of Clinton, Louisiana.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up.
Where supposedly they were there in a voter drive with Oswald trying to get a job at a mental institution in Jackson, Louisiana.
Now, how far is Jackson from Louisiana?
Jackson and Clinton, or Jackson and
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. When Oswald, when that they were seen together at the.
I think Clinton was a couple of hours away, hour and a half. I'm not sure exactly how far away, but.
What Shaw, with his connections in the business world, why would he have to take Lee Harvey Oswald way up there to get him a job?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. I mean, it would have been really easy for Clay Shaw to get Oswald a job anywhere in New Orleans.
I would think he would pick up the phone.
You want to go out to Jackson and Clinton to work there, and also don't forget, it doesn't really fit. I mean, that was a bastion of the KKK, and the civil rights movement had a lot of work to do up in Clinton. I don't know whether that's the kind of place that Oswald really would want to live, given his ideological proclivities. And
I believe in the trial, and we'll go back to that for just won't get started there. But since we're on it, we just go ahead and finish it. Didn't they have a deputy that testified of seeing Shaw and Ferry and Oswald together?
Well, there were several witnesses from Clinton who saw them together in a Cadillac there. There's all sorts of inconsistencies with their stories. They were KKK people. I believe it was all fabricated. It was all manufactured.
And they're testifying about some 3 guys that they seen 6 years previous.
Yeah, I mean, they supposedly saw Lee Harvey Oswald. Not one of them came forward to the Warren Commissioner to the FBI. And they said, and when they asked why, they said, well, if they wanted to know, they could have come here. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. One of them actually said that he did contact the FBI afterwards, but there's no evidence of that in the FBI files. And in fact, what I found interesting was Andrew Chambra, who worked for Garrison, asked the FBI, did you ever get word from this guy that they saw Oswald and Clinton? And the FBI actually answered Chambra. They sent him a letter back saying, no, there's no evidence that he ever contacted us. And I have that letter. I posted that letter on my blog. And of course, that was not told to the defense. There was no discovery in Louisiana courts, so they were not aware that the FBI said that they had never been contacted.
And I'd just like to ask for everybody out there who's listening, you see, 3 guys sitting in a car, how much attention are you going to pay for them, that you're going to be able to pay attention to them, that you're going to be able to testify 6 years later? Yes, that's the man that I seen with Lee Harvey. I mean, it just,
well, I find it funny. I mean, their testimonies changed over time. I mean, John Manchester at the Clay Shaw trial said, that he saw the men in the car and he talked to one of the men. But many years later, before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, he then said that he asked Clay Shaw for his driver's license and that he checked the car, and the car actually belonged to the International Trade Mart. Well, guess what? The House Select Committee on Assassinations actually called Jim Garrison, and they said, did you ever check about whether the car did belong to the Trade Mart? And what did Garrison say? He said, I didn't need to check. I just trusted his testimony. Now, what kind of investigator is that? Now, I should add, Don Carpenter, who did the best biography of Clay Shaw, went through, I think, over 100 boxes of material from the Trade Mart, and they did not lease or own any cars.
The trademark did not own or lease any cars? Really?
No.
I found that I found that very fascinating. I mean, yeah. Okay, so and on a chance conversation with what was it, Senator Long, I believe, from
supposedly Russell Long, Garrison was talking to Russell Long and who told him, I don't believe in the Warren Commission, and then that sort of supposedly got Garrison going on the Kennedy assassination. I don't know how true the story is, but certainly in the fall of 1966, Garrison started reading Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment, and he read Harold Weisberg's Whitewash. Whitewash was a very big influence on Jim Garrison, and that's what got him going. There was sort of assassination fever in the country, and Garrison decided, well, I'll reopen the case and look at the New Orleans connections.
So, who did he? Did he latch on to Ferry again initially, or did he go back? Or is it true? Does the movie have any truth to it, where he goes back and talks to Andrews about Shaw? I guess what I'm asking is, which direction did he go first? I mean, who did he latch on to and what led him to Clay Shaw?
Well, there were two things. So the first thing he did was to go to Dean Andrews, and he wanted to find out who was Clay Bertrand. And so he had dinner with Dean Andrews, and Garrison brought with him a copy of Whitewash, and he wanted to know who was Clay Bertrand, and of course Dean Andrews was not going to tell him, obviously because there was no Clay Bertrand, and so that lead sort of went nowhere. But then he also wanted to look into David Ferry. He knew that was the other lead, and so they quickly called in David Ferry for questioning. And they talked to David Ferry. You could read the memo of their interview with David Ferry on my blog.
Okay. So they interviewed Ferry, and
yep.
So
where does it go? He didn't go anywhere. I mean, Ferry just told him what he told the FBI years ago. I went ice skating, and that's it. And so Garrison was like, "There's nothing. What can you do?"
Yeah. So how does Garrison then, turn to Shaw? I mean, and lock in on him. I
think it was one of his deputies who was working for him, and they were sort of looking at the Warren report, and they sort of saw the part about Dean Andrews and realized, who was this guy Clay Bertrand? And they knew that Clay Bertrand was gay. They knew that Clay Bertrand supposedly spoke Spanish. And so they thought, well, who speaks Spanish? Who is gay? And who is the same first name of Clay? Well, Clay Shaw. And Garrison believed that gay people, when they use pseudonyms, always use the same first name. So they were looking for people named Clay. And so it all fit. Clay Bertrand must be Clay Shaw. And they called in Clay Shaw for questioning.
If I'm not mistaken, they called him in around Christmas that year.
It was right before Christmas. I think it was like 2 days before Christmas.
Okay, and so investigation keeps going along. Before Shaw was arrested. Excuse me, I lost my train of thought. The Ferry, of course, dies a week before he's arrested. The meeting in the Fontainebleau Hotel. I'm a dead man. You've got me killed. The mystery. Did that meeting?
Once they brought in Ferry for questioning, he knew that something was going on, and so he knew that Garrison was looking at the JFK assassination, and that made him somewhat obsessed. He wanted to find out what was going on, and he started he started visiting people like Carlos Bergier and other people to find out what was going on. What was Oswald all about? Ferry started reading assassination books. So he started getting a little obsessed himself with trying to figure out what was happening. At the same time, I should say that Ferry was under 24-hour surveillance by Jim Garrison. And actually, Jim Garrison actually had some undercover agents who infiltrated David Ferry's life. I feel sorry for Ferry because there was a lot of pressure being put on him. And at some point, before he died, once the press got wind of the investigation, they started harassing Ferry. He got nonstop phone calls. And so what happened was, I think Garrison's men put him up in the Fontainebleau motel for one night so that he can get away from the press. And then he sort of snuck out at some point in the evening. He did not confess, as you see in the JFK movie. That is completely made up.
Even in the movie, he never really actually confessed. If you start listening to the whole thing, he never really said he was involved. He just
No.
He said, "Yeah, I knew Oswald is my civil, patrol unit and stuff like that." And he never really even, the only thing he said was about Shaw was he's an untouchable man. The highest glimpse. And for those who think we're going to say that Ferry was murdered, you want to tell them how Ferry died or what the cause of death was?
Well, he was prior to his death. He was very sick. He was having trouble walking upstairs. He was having headaches. He actually told people that he had encephalitis. He was a very sick man, and anybody who came in contact with him could see that. And it was written about, even in one of the Garrison memos. They talked about how sick he was. So he was very sick. And on February 22nd, he had a Berry aneurysm. So a blood vessel burst in his brain, and he died. He had a full forensic autopsy, which indicated it was completely natural causes. And in fact, they found evidence of an earlier bleed that he had. So it was completely natural. There was nothing suspicious. Now, of course, there were two notes.
That's what I was fixing to come to.
And and Garrison believed they were suicide notes, but again, they were just, look, David Ferry thought he was dying, and so he left a couple of notes to his friends because of that. They weren't suicide notes. They were just notes. You might die if you thought you were dying.
And when I've read them too, and when people read them, they don't read as suicide notes to me at all. It kind of seems like what's the word? Not even really a goodbye, but the purpose. I don't know really what word I'm looking for.
Yeah, well, one was to somebody he had loved, and he was a little upset, and blah blah blah. You spurned my love, blah blah blah. But once Ferry died, that really gave Garrison carte blanche to say whatever he wanted about David Ferry. He could no longer be contradicted, and so all of a sudden, that elevated Ferry up in the food chain to being the suspect, the villain in the case. And you could say whatever you wanted about David Ferry because he was not going to say anything. He couldn't say anything. And so he became sort of, as my friend, as Stephen Roy puts it, an unlikely villain. And he looked the part. He looked.
Oh yeah, he did. Very heady. Very had a very strange look. Do you think they would have both been indicted, or do you think that it would have been just let go? The case.
I think if Ferry lived, I think that the whole investigation would have died because there was no evidence. He had nothing against David Ferry. At that point, Perry Russo had not come forward. He had no evidence against Shaw at all. All the leads went nowhere. So at some point, he probably would have been forced to drop it. But having Ferry died changed everything, and then Perry Russo came forward, which gave Garrison his golden opportunity.
And he identified. Excuse me. So this investigation is still going on, and they're investigating. And Alcott was his. No, excuse me. Lou Ivan, his chief investigator. What
Yeah.
happens? Where's the Bertrand at? I mean, he found Bertrand, right? Didn't he find a Clay Bertrand in the quarter?
Well, there was a real Clay Bertrand in the quarter. So they both the defense and the prosecution found Clayton Bertrand, who was a bartender in the quarter, but they realized that wasn't the Clay Bertrand they were looking for, because they were looking for a man who used the name Clay Bertrand, and this guy wasn't the guy.
And just so people don't know, what did Mr. Ivan's memo say to Jim Garrison about Clay Bertrand?
Well, it's a really interesting memo, and basically Lou Ivan went through the French Quarter looking for Clay Bertrand, and they couldn't find him. There was no evidence that he existed, and it's right there in a memo. And in fact, if you go back to the Warren Commission, you could see in Commission Document 75, you could see it online. The FBI and the Secret Service back in November, December 1963 also searched the French Quarter looking for Clay Bertrand, and they could not find Clay Bertrand either. And so there was no evidence that this man really existed.
I believe Ivan, I can't quote it word for word, but he said, and these investigators all have sources and stuff. I believe he said, I'm quite sure with my underground contacts, if the Clay Bertrand existed, I would have located him.
That's right. And also in the Richard Billings diary, he was a reporter for Life magazine, editor, and he kept a diary. And in his diary, he said that Andrew Chambra put the squeeze on the French Quarter to find Bertrand and came up empty.
All right, so we go through grand jury investigation, and they indict Clay Shaw. Then it goes to a 3-judge panel.
Well, I should say before you talk about the panel.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
There are 3 different ways that you can indict people in New Orleans back then. Jim Garrison actually had the power to indict anybody in a non-capital case by himself. He didn't need the grand jury. You could also go to the grand jury. You can also have a preliminary hearing to indict people. Garrison chose all 3. So he indicted Clay Shaw before the grand jury. Then he went to the grand jury, and then he went and had a preliminary hearing. I think he wanted to cover his ass to make sure that all of them agreed with his decision to indict Clay Shaw. Oh,
so he had 3. Then he had a grand jury and a 3-judge panel say, yes, there's enough evidence to go to trial.
That's right.
And the 3-judge panel, they could have dismissed all of it?
Well, they could have. And here's the other thing that's interesting. The reason why Garrison asked for a preliminary hearing is that whatever side asked for a preliminary hearing first gets to pick the judges. And so Garrison preempted Shaw by asking for a preliminary hearing first so he could pick a friendly judge who then picked the other 2 judges. And so they had friendly judges on the panel.
So it's upheld, and then we go to court. And Garrison, if I recall right, he gave the opening statements. And then tell everybody, who was the 3 attorneys who actually prosecuted the case?
Well, Alcott did most of the prosecution on the Clay Shaw stuff. And then they went to, I think it was Ozer and Alford who did the Warren Commission stuff. So there were 2 phases of the trial. There was the Clay Shaw phase, and then there was the Warren Commission phase, where they put the Warren Commission on trial.
Scambria, what all did he have? I remember reading transcripts, and I can remember stuff coming up with Scambria a lot, and I want to say it had to do with, since we're getting into witnesses now, and you brought him up, Perry Russo.
Yeah.
I think that's where I remember Scambria's name coming up a lot. So why don't you go ahead and tell us about Perry Russo?
Well, after Ferry died, Perry Russo, who knew David Ferry, Russo was an insurance salesman living in Baton Rouge. So he contacted the press in Baton Rouge to say, look, I knew this guy. I knew David Ferry, and in fact, back in the early 60s, he had talked about getting Kennedy. We will get him. And so he was interviewed on TV, he was in the print press, and then he decided to write a letter to Jim Garrison. to say you should interview me. And Garrison sent Andrew Chambra, his name was Chambra, to Baton Rouge to interview Perry Russo. So he interviewed Perry Russo, comes back to New Orleans. He writes a 3,500-word memo, and there is nothing in that memo about any party to discuss the assassination. There's no mention of Shaw or Oswald at this party. Nothing. And then, so it sort of stood out. Did Perry Russo not say anything? And in fact, it was quite embarrassing to Garrison that Chambra wrote it that way. And Chambra said, "Oh, he just forgot. It's all in his notes." And then he claimed his notes disappeared. So anyways, they brought Chambra to New Orleans, and they promptly gave him sodium pentothal, truth serum, and interviewed him under truth serum and started asking him a variety of leading questions. Then they hypnotized him 3 times, and they basically implanted a false memory.
Is it not true that each time they did it, they had to add more and more and more to it? And I think one of the words was, "Picture you're looking at a TV screen, or you're watching the TV."
Well, that was one of the opening of the hypnotic sessions where you're looking at a TV screen, blah blah blah. But they were always leading him. They were the ones that talked about assassination. They were the ones that talked about Bertrand. They were always the ones who were introducing new stuff into the interviews and sort of prompting him all the way along through the interview for his story.
Do you think Perry actually knew Perry?
I think he did know Ferry.
Russo?
I think Perry Russo did know Ferry, but I don't think they were close friends because the other friends of David Ferry didn't know Perry Russo. But I'm sure they probably knew each other. They just weren't huge friends.
What do you think prompted Russo to do this? 15 minutes of fame, get his name in the paper.
Yeah, I think it was 15 minutes of fame. Get your name in the paper. What the hell? Big man on campus or whatever. Be the big guy. But I think he never anticipated working with Garrison and what that would lead him into.
Dreamed of being.
And it turned out to be, I guess, a nightmare for Perry Russo.
Yeah, putting a man, ended up being a man put in prison. Okay, so let's go through the case. The case Garrison has against him. The rock solid witness, a man who looked like he was could not be impeached in any way on the stand. Charles Spiegel or Speisel, I believe.
Charles Spiegel.
I always want to say Spiegel.
Yeah,
very powerful witness, right?
Yeah, he was an accountant from New York, and he dressed really nicely and looked the part and spoke really well. And he was another witness who again put Clay Shaw and David Ferry at another party, where they discussed the assassination. It's sort of strange to have all these parties where they discuss the assassination.
Yeah, that's true. I never didn't think about that. I was like,
no, I mean, my God, I mean, who would do that? But so they discussed the assassination, and fortunately for Shaw's attorneys, they learned about who Charles Spiegel was just before he testified. And in fact, he was a real nutcase from New York who had been suing the city and the police and other people for many years, claiming that they had hypnotized him over the course of 16 years. They interfered with his sex life, et cetera, et cetera. There was this big conspiracy against him, and they were able to cross-examine him on the stand, and he came out looking like he was a complete lunatic. And so it was one of the funnier pieces of the trial. By the way, what's interesting is Garrison never transcribed Charles Spiegel's testimony.
Yeah, because I remember I never got to read that in the.
Not transcribed. The only way you could read his testimony is through the newspapers.
And just surrounded. What about? Tell us about his daughter.
Yeah, he actually every time his daughter went off to university, he would fingerprint her so that when she came back, he could check to make sure it was the same person. This is the kind of man Charles Spiegel was.
But that was just a CIA plan, right, to ruin the Garrison case.
Well, that's what Garrison would claim. Yep, it was the CIA plan to ruin the case. And in fact, on the stand, Charles Spiesel said that he told Garrison's men about his court cases and the hypnotism. He claimed that he had told them. And so I think they never realized that Clay Shaw's attorneys would find it out.
That's some pretty good investigation right there. Oh, okay, I've got a good one for you. I mean, but tell us about that. I mean, that witness. I mean, it was. I mean, this is ironclad stuff here now. The mailman who delivered the letters to a Clem Bertrand or a Clay Bertrand.
Yeah, they found a mailman who claimed that he had delivered letters to Clay Shaw that were addressed to Clay Bertrand. But on the stand under cross-examination, they gave him a bunch of other fictitious names, and he said that he delivered mail from those people too. But what's interesting is that James Kirkwood and Hugh Ainsworth found out that the mailman's son was under investigation by Jim Garrison for I think a local break-in, and so that was hanging over his head. And I think that he probably went along with this to get his son off the hook.
Yeah, I remember when I first read that, when I was going through the trial and everything, and I came across his testimony, and I thought, man, that's some pretty. I mean, to me at first, I said, yes, that's some pretty solid evidence right there. He's delivering evidence, and when they start naming off all these fictitious names, and he delivered this on this date, and then I was like, it just totally fell apart. Everything then. Let's see. The witness. Other solid evidence they have in the VIP room where he signed the book, and Garrison brought in this expert handwriting witness.
Yeah, this was the Eastern Airlines VIP room where a witness claimed that Clay Shaw had signed the guest book as Clay Bertrand, and that he was accompanied with 4 people from Venezuela and some State Department people who were visiting. And when Garrison's men went to investigate, they interviewed the State Department people who were with the Venezuelans, and they denied that Clay Shaw was there. And in fact, one of the State Department people knew Clay Shaw from international trade. He said, I know Clay Shaw. He was not there. And so what did Garrison do? They basically had that witness changed her testimony and leave out the Venezuelans from the testimony, so that that would not be part of what she would say. Basically, changing her testimony. It's just the whole thing was ridiculous. The signature.
What about that expert witness? They had an expert handwriting witness that's she swore up and down that was Bertrand.
Yeah, in fact, Garrison's first handwriting expert looked at the signatures, and then Garrison, for some reason, wouldn't use this expert. It was the expert he always used. You can imagine why. So he had to turn to somebody else who, the morning, looked at the signatures, did really very little analysis. She actually took out a pair of binoculars from her purse, and she used binoculars to look at the signatures, and she testified. But she had very little credibility. And in fact, on my blog, I have the signatures. I have the Clay Bertrand signature on my blog, and Clay Shaw signing as Clay Bertrand, and you could see the incredible differences between the two.
Is it true that she also had? I think she took a class or something, but she was not a handwriting expert.
Yeah, she took a class in the 1930s, and I should say, this seems funny. Clay Shaw using the pseudonym Clay Bertrand to plan the assassination, and then 3 years later is still using the same pseudonym.
Yeah, that is a very good point. I didn't think about that. Oh, and one other thing
was he?
That people, just so people know, this Clay Bertrand was written like below the last line on the ledger.
It was the last line on the register. It was supposedly in December 1966. So this was years after he had discussed the assassination with David Ferry using the same pseudonym. It just doesn't make sense.
And I think, you make you correct me on this because you know so much more. If I'm not mistaken, he was out of state during that time, actually, too, wasn't he?
Shaw during the VIP room.
Yeah.
No, I think he was there. But again,
Okay.
all the other people who signed the guest book on top of his name, none of them saw him there.
Okay. Some reason I thought he was out of state, but I may have that totally confused with something else. Um, excuse me. Okay, so now the witness that, and first of all, so for the people who don't know, uh, tell us who Willie O'Keefe, the characters he was based on.
Well, Willie O'Keefe is a composite character in Oliver Stone's film. He was the gay hustler who was in prison that Garrison went to interview in the film. In real life, he was a composite of four gay people: Perry Russo, William Morris, David Logan, and Raymond Brochures. And so Stone took bits and pieces of those four people and melded them together into one character, Willie O'Keefe.
Now, Raymond Brochures, he was a preacher or priest, is that right?
He was a would-be preacher in San Francisco who was fighting for gay rights. He was a very, very strange man who made a lot of enemies along the way, made up a lot of stories, actually claimed for a while he was David Ferry's roommate. He was called in to New Orleans to be questioned. They did 4 long interviews with Raymond Brochures. He was a complete nut. The odds are he never knew David Ferry, or if he knew him very briefly, he certainly didn't know even the layout of his apartment. There's no credibility to Raymond Brochures at all.
Now, is he the one that Reagan refused to extradite?
No. This is completely somebody else. It was Edgar Eugene Bradley. Garrison actually indicted Edgar Eugene Bradley, who was a promoter of Christian radio. He indicted him for conspiracy to kill Kennedy. And at the extradition hearing from California, Garrison presented no evidence. And so Reagan had no choice but to deny his extradition. Thank God, it was the right choice.
Yeah. So tell us about David Logan.
David Logan was basically, we don't know that much about David Logan, but he was a gay hustler who claimed to have sex with Clay Shaw, but he claimed that he went to a party where he saw Clay Shaw and he saw David Ferry at the same party, but they weren't together. And he didn't know until the next day that David Ferry was even there. So he's a witness that conspiracy theorists say that link Shaw to Ferry, but in fact, when you read his telephone interview with James Alcock, he doesn't really link them together. He just says that they were basically at the same party, but not together.
Okay, so we've covered Russo, we've covered Brochure, Logan, and who was the other one? I forgot.
William Morris. William Morris.
Okay, all right.
So William Morris was another sort of, I think he was a gay hustler, but he also claimed to have sex with Clay Shaw. And you could read a long interview, but, again, loses credibility when he claims he saw Jack Ruby at Clay Shaw's house.
Oh, God.
Stuff like that. And so, again, another person who was in prison. He was in prison at the time he was interviewed. And, of course, was not called to testify in the trial because he had no credibility.
Then you've got that very important witness, Vernon Bundy. Tied him the bunch train wall. He gave him gave Oswald money.
Yep. So Vernon Bundy was a heroin addict who went to shoot up on the seawall of Lake Pontchartrain, and lo and behold, while he's shooting up, who shows up? But Clay Shaw in his car, and there's Lee Harvey Oswald, and they're talking, and I think he gave Oswald money, and then when Oswald was leaving, a piece of paper fell out of his pocket, and it was a Fair Play for Cuba flyer that Bundy picked up. And so he was one of the early witnesses at the preliminary hearing to tie Clay Shaw to Lee Harvey Oswald.
Is there any I think I covered the major ones. Is there any other prosecution witnesses that I didn't touch on that you think should be told about?
Well, in the trial, I mean, there was, again, there were so the prosecution had such a ridiculous case, and there was really nothing against Clay Shaw. So it was very, very meager pickings for the prosecution. A large part of the case had to do with the Warren reports. I mean, what Garrison really wanted to do was put the Warren report on trial. And so they had a lot of witnesses who talked. Even Abraham Zapruder was a witness.
Oh, really?
They played the Zapruder film 10 times in court. So that was a major feature of the trial, which had nothing to do with Clay Shaw.
So, yeah, right. Yeah, that's true. That shouldn't be admissible. All right. So the prosecution rests, and it's the defense turn, and they put Clay Shaw on the stand. Clay Shaw perjured himself.
No, he did not perjure himself in any way. I think he told the truth. They asked him if he worked for the CIA. He said no. He did not ever work for the CIA, although he was an informant on international trade for the CIA, unpaid, back in the 1950s. But he did not work for the CIA. So I don't think he perjured himself.
For those who don't know, he was a domestic contact agent. I believe there was 150,000 at the time.
That's right. There were many, many businessmen who reported back on their international trips to the CIA, and that's what Clay Shaw did.
And Clay Shaw, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it was from 1948 to 56 was when he did this reporting. Okay.
He was basically a patriotic American who was reporting on international trade.
So, there. What other? Because I can't remember off the top of my head. Because I know I could. Any other witnesses, important witnesses beside? I mean, because to me, he was his own best witness. That the defense put up.
Well, Dean Andrews also testified for the defense.
That's right. Yeah, I always get mixed up because in the movie they get them all mixed up. But yeah, they had Andrews on there testifying that he wasn't there. And that was an important witness. Do you remember? Or do you know how long the actual trial went on? Like how many days?
Yeah, I think it was a little over a month.
Oh, really? Over a month? Yeah. Oh yeah. I remember one witness I forgot to ask you about, and glad I didn't do that because, man, this is another damning piece of evidence. I mean, Clay Shaw told Aloysius Haverhorst said he was Clay Bertrand. It's on the card.
Yeah, well, so this policeman basically testified that when he was questioning Clay Bertrand after being arrested, that he asked Clay Bertrand, "Do you have an alias?" He asked Clay Shaw, "Do you have an alias?" And he said Clay Bertrand, and he typed it on the card. The problem with the testimony was that there was another policeman who was also there, who was listening, and he testified that did not happen, that he was never asked for an alias, and he never said Clay Bertrand. And of course, his lawyer was not there, so the judge even said this was inadmissible testimony.
And just to kind of think here, I mean, if you've been arrested for murdering the president based on the alias of being Clay Bertrand, are you going to tell a cop you've used that alias?
No, it's one of these things where, I mean, how stupid was Clay Shaw? I mean, my God, he used the alias for years, and then when you're asked by a policeman, he says it. I mean, geez.
Yeah, that just got me. One thing that I've always wondered, and it just could be the way judges are, and way some of them are so don't believe anything a witness says. The judge said, Haggerty said I think it was in 91, he said that Shaw was lying through his teeth. What would make him say that? Or do you have any idea why he believed that?
Haggerty was homophobic.
Okay.
So he really believed that there was a small clique of gay men who all knew each other, a very tight clique, tighter than the CIA. And that how could he not know David Ferry? They were all gay. They knew each other. So he was very, very homophobic. And in fact, in one of these days, I will do a blog post with some of the Kirkwood interviews of Haggerty, which shows his homophobia.
Do you think that it's possible Garrison went after them because Garrison may have been gay himself?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, Garrison might very well have been gay. There's a lot of evidence that he was. He certainly, it appears that he molested a 13-year-old boy at the New Orleans Athletic Club. There's several witnesses, even amongst his own staff, that claim he was gay. Whether that led to the prosecution of Clay Shaw, whether there was some internal homophobia because of it, because of being in the closet, I don't know. It's a psychological conclusion I'm not ready to say, but it's quite possible. But it does appear, I believe, that he was quite possibly he was gay.
What about this? I don't know how long it was before incident at a dinner, and Garrison's wife got into it, and Garrison did something, and Shaw intervened.
Yeah, Garrison was at a restaurant with his wife, and they got into an argument, and he threw a glass of wine in her face, and Clay Shaw intervened to stop the fight. And that certainly appeared it did happen. Clay Shaw wrote about it in his journal. And maybe that was the start of a feud as well.
And for a lot of people who don't know, Clay Shaw was about 6'4", 225, barrel-chested man. Not somebody you'd really want to have to, get in a physical altercation with. I wouldn't want to.
They're both tall guys. I mean, Garrison was 6'7", so.
But I think Shaw had a lot more mass on him. From what I've heard, Shaw was a very good stout sized man. Yes, I mean I've often wondered if that had led the part of it, because I'd read, and a friend told me this, and I don't know if it was around the time, but that the incident at the New Orleans Athletic Club came about the same time of the Shaw trial. I don't know how much truth there was to that. That played a role of Garrison not being in the courtroom, but that's the next thing I wanted to touch on. How many witnesses did Garrison actually, interview or cross-examine? To my knowledge, it was only a few that basically they handled the case as assistant DAs.
Yeah, Garrison really wasn't in the courtroom at all very, very, very often. I mean, it really was. He left it to James Alcock was the main guy. And in fact, one of the things that was quite funny was that the way Garrison did the investigation was he had different people doing different parts of the investigation, and they never talked. So you could be an investigator for Garrison looking at X and somebody else looking at Y, and they would not discuss things, and only Garrison knew it all. And so at one point he went to James Alcock. He said, "I want you to be the one who's going to present it in court." And Alcock said, "Well, okay, what's the case? There must be more of a case than I'm hearing. What is it?" And he realized there really wasn't much of a case at all. And I think he was shocked by how little evidence had been turned up against Clay Shaw.
Well, I read one of the, and I can't remember if it was which one of the three it was, but they said, or they was talking about when they was looking at Shaw testify, and they could just tell that the jury was not buying or believing him and was not buying the case. But one of the guys said that they believed in their case and they believed it, that believed in prosecuting it. And I've often wondered, did they make that statement because they were so embarrassed because there wasn't a case that they just made that to try to cover themselves? Because I would hate to know that I'm fixing to. If I'm a district attorney and that's been dropped in my lap, that I've got to go out here and try to make a case out of this right here, and you have nothing to make it out of. I mean, what do you say? No, we never had a case. We should never went to court. I'm actually surprised someone didn't resign over the fact that instead of prosecuting the man. Okay, so now
they all felt, a lot of them felt that there was if they stood with Garrison, they could become judges. Alcock did become a judge. Ozer became a judge. Ivan, they all had careers to move forward. So it's hard to come out against an incumbent district attorney who was so powerful.
Yeah, that's a good point right there. Just kind of, yeah, holding on. Yeah.
But I should say that after David Ferry died, many of them actually went to Garrison and said, "Look, drop the case. Here is your opportunity to drop the case. You'll come out looking like a hero. You did your best. You found this guy who was the suspect. He died. Your case is over. Move on." And he wouldn't do it. He said, I believe I'm going to solve the crime of the century. So they tried.
We know he had mental problems. You believe Garrison really thought he was going to do that, or he was so far in he wouldn't turn back, or he just wanted the fame, or he was just plain nuts, or a combination of all of it?
Combination of all of them. I think he was nuts. I think he had assassination fever. I think he believed he would solve the case. I think he became more frustrated over time as he found nothing. But once you're down that rabbit hole, it's awfully hard to get out.
Yeah, painting himself into a corner. Where was Garrison at when he received word of the verdict?
Well, he was, I guess, in his office. He wasn't even there, and
Yeah.
I think he was extremely disappointed in the verdict, which came very, very fast. In fact, the verdict only took them a little over 50 minutes to come up with a verdict, and I hear it would have been faster, but they all had to pee. It was late.
Also
They had to line up to pee.
Yeah, I heard that when Garrison got that or got word of the verdict, that he flew into a blind rage over the jury's verdict. So they acquitted Clay Shaw, but then the jury tells Mark Lane that he proved conspiracy, right?
Well, that's what Mark Lane says. In fact, Mark Lane promised that he was going to write a complete report about what the jury believed, but that report never came forward. I don't know how many jury members he talked to. He talked to a few, but many others said they never talked to him. James Kirkwood did talk to a lot of jury members, and they tell a very different story. I mean, some of them did think there was a conspiracy. Many of them didn't think there was a conspiracy. They certainly felt that Garrison had no case. That was clear.
And even if they told Mark Lane that, or they told somebody else that, I mean, they believed conspiracy. So what? I mean, a lot of people didn't believe.
Yeah. So what? I mean, the other thing is keep in mind that I feel sorry for Clay Shaw's defense because they really did. Was it really their job to defend the Warren report? I mean, that really wasn't their job. They really had no interest in defending the Warren report. So Garrison put it on trial, and they were the ones left to sort of cross-examine, but that wasn't their expertise, and that wasn't what they really wanted to do. And so it's an unfair question about whether Garrison proved conspiracy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I can see where the jurors, especially that time when they'd just seen the Zapruder film, and until people learn of the physics and stuff, and the head. Of course, that looks like a shot from the front. So I can see where that's the first time they're seeing it and seeing C399 and explaining the magic bullet. So I can see where a lot of the people thought that Garrison had, in fact, proved a conspiracy. But I know none of them believed that Clay Shaw was involved. I read one juror say that he kept waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, and then he was like, "That's it."
I think they were really shocked at just how little Garrison had.
And another juror said, I think it was one of the alternates when he got excused, that as a joke he voted guilty in the case. But he said they had nothing on Shaw, and that brought me back something that I was going to ask that I wanted to ask later. So here you are, and I'll make it a two-part question. But first, so here you are. You're Clay Shaw. or and Dean Andrew knows you by Clay Bertrand or something. Shaw's a very powerful man with connections and knows lots of people. Here is Lee Harvey Oswald, who's been accused of killing the president of the United States. And let's just say, first of all, Shaw's, there's nothing that ties Shaw to any kind of a conspiracy. He's just friends with him. This is my buddy. I want to help him out. Are you going to call a municipal court lawyer to go hire him to go defend him, or are you going to go get the biggest defense attorney in Dallas and get him a legal team to take him to trial? I mean, are you going to call a municipal court?
I mean, my God, the last person I would want to hire would be Dean Andrews.
I'm going after the top lawyer in the world. Now, here's the next.
Lee Harvey Oswald himself wanted a political lawyer.
John Abt.
John Abt. So he wanted somebody political. But I think Dean Andrews, the fact that you'd hire a lawyer from New Orleans who was he himself said he was a municipal hack lawyer.
He's a court lawyer. He's handling public intoxications and stuff like that. Are you going after him, or are you going after a guy who's going after? And then here's the other one that I always love to bring up to conspiracy theorists who try to connect Clay Shaw there. I said, okay, Clay Bertrand is involved in this assassination. He's orchestrated it. He's helped set Lee Harvey Oswald up. Why are you going to hire a lawyer if you're going to silence him on Sunday? Why are you going to put yourself in the middle of that? Why are you going to get him a lawyer?
That's a very good question.
And nobody can ever answer that for me. Why are you going to implicate yourself in it by calling them and giving them your name if you're just going to put him to death then? If you're involved in setting him up, you're involved in framing him, you're involved in let's call him a lawyer.
You're using too much logic here.
I've had to start applying it to it, because at first it sounds, all great, and when I start going, well, wait a second, none of this makes sense. I'm gonna hire a municipal court lawyer to represent, the greatest assassin in the world, or I'm gonna be involved in framing this guy and then getting myself up if we're only going to silence him on Sunday. I mean, it just doesn't add up. And another thing, how would Clay Shaw be able to orchestrate an assassination in Dallas?
He was quite the man.
So how much did you told me this the other day when we went over let's go over again. How much did his defense actually cost him?
Well, he was quite lucky that his attorneys didn't charge him all that much money. I think he paid them $5,000 or $10,000 for the defense over a number of years. He may have paid more, but he paid a lot. He had to pay all the detective bills. And so because there was no discovery in the Louisiana courts back then, every time there was a rumor about a new witness, they would have to hire detectives to go and find the witness or find out about the witnesses. And he paid over $30,000 in detective bills to investigate various people. And so that was the big cost of Clay Shaw was the detectives.
And then, if I'm not mistaken, Garrison charged him with perjury.
Yeah. So the not guilty verdict came on Saturday night. On Monday morning, Garrison charged him with 2 counts of perjury, not knowing Oswald and not knowing Ferry, and both counts carried a 10-year prison term.
And was that not the same amount of time it would have got for conspiring to murder the president?
Yeah, same amount of time, and so the whole thing started again, and that took 2 years for Clay Shaw finally went to federal court and got the whole thing quashed, but it took 2 years to do that.
That puts it around 71, 72.
71, yeah. They had a 3-day hearing in January of 1971 in court in which Garrison had to testify under oath. And then a few months later was the final ruling to quash the prosecution.
And if I'm not mistaken, because I know I've read the whole time of when it started, because actually he lived a lot longer than most people do. His first symptoms of becoming sick was in January of '73, and he died on, I think, on August 14th, 1974, or August something, 1974.
Yeah, August '74 he died. He had been showing symptoms for quite a while, and he had lung cancer. He was a very heavy smoker. And it's very unfortunate because he was in the middle of suing Garrison for $5 million of damages from the case. And because Clay Shaw had no sons or daughters under the Louisiana law, he was not able to continue that damage suit against Garrison.
And then I remember they tried to make something out of it, because I pointed this out to somebody too. God, the Goon Squad, they had to take out Shaw. They murdered him in August of '74 because the body got secretly taken out.
You know, Garrison actually believed, and other people believe, there was basically something suspicious about Clay Shaw's death. And for a while, he tried to talk the coroner into exhuming the body. And the coroner started the process, but realized it would take too long, and actually abandoned the exhumation. There was nothing mysterious. He had been seeing a doctor for quite some time. He was quite ill. He died of lung cancer. Very sad.
And under Louisiana law, and I'm sure you've as much as you know, you've read this whole account. Under Louisiana law, if you've been seen by your attending physician in 24 hours, it's not required. And I know that I think it was mere hours before he died, his attending physician had showed up and said nothing else could be done.
Yeah, the police actually did a short investigation of his death, found nothing mysterious, everything was legal, and so it was dropped. And I think the Clay Shaw's attorneys were very, very anxious to get him into the ground as fast as possible, so there would not be another mystery and not be another controversy in the case that would allow Garrison to go a bit crazy.
Because I read the whole the part. I forgot where I pulled up, but it starts. I forgot where it is, but anyway, it details his sickness and getting treatments here. And at one point, he quit, and his doctor said he thought he was drinking so much, but then drinking a good bit. And then I was reading about the last week of his life. He had a caregiver, and he was basically incoherent, and said he was eating candy, and the caregiver was there when he finally expired, and they took the man, took him away. Really sad. So because basically he not only did Garrison ruin his life, but he had 2 years left before he got sick.
Yeah, they certainly didn't want him to ruin his death.
Yeah.
The whole thing is what an horrible miscarriage of justice, and I really feel, and it's very sad that Oliver Stone re-victimized Clay Shaw a second time in his film. Clay Shaw was a good man. He was an American patriot who did his duty in World War II, did his duty in helping the CIA in the Cold War. He was beloved in New Orleans, and he was a good person.
And that was going to be the next thing that I wanted to bring up is it's really sad that Stone had to go that route, because it led to a whole new generation of people. Nobody would know who Clay Shaw was in these assassination forms, really, if it hadn't been for Garrison. I mean, nobody would have heard of him, and he brings it back up and tries to rewrite the verdict.
Garrison would have been a minor chapter in the history of the assassination, if not for Oliver Stone. So Oliver Stone elevated Garrison, made him quite wealthy, elevated Clay Shaw. It's very, very unfortunate. He could have told an assassination story in many other ways, but he chose Jim Garrison, and it was a very bad choice.
Tell because when I messed up the other day, tell again the way if you was going to do an assassination film, tell how you would do it again, because that was a very unique way to put it that I think would actually make a really good movie.
It would. The way I would do an assassination film was I would set it in the early '60s, and I would try to show people how the CIA was working with the mob and anti-Castro Cubans to assassinate Castro. And so that to show that whole melange of sort of weird people working together in a place like New Orleans would make for a very, very good picture. And my last scene in the film would be the Kennedy assassination, and leave it there.
And and you leave nothing, leave it up to the
leave it up to the imagination of people watching the film to see if there's a connection. But to show those shadowy connections and how these people were all working together, which was true, would make for a very powerful film.
As in JFK, you've got these people who some of them don't even know each other, and then it's just kind of like connect the dots. Jack Martin, very, very new Oswald, and and really none of them, none of them knew each other all together, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Okay, I got one for you that I did with Bill Brown, and I did with Steve Rowe. You are Garrison's lead prosecutor. What are you going to go after to try to prove Shaw's ties to the assassination? What's your main thing you're going to hold on? I mean, your evidence. I mean, your strongest thing that you think you've got that I've got him here on this, or that you're going to at least try to make a case out of.
Well, look, it's a hard question to answer because there's so little. I mean, this is why Alcock, look, Alcock did the best he could, and all he really had was Perry Russo. There was really no other evidence that tied Clay Shaw to anything regarding the assassination. So, look, it's an impossible case. Alcock did the best he could. And that's what I would do. I mean, what else could you do? I mean, there's nothing else.
Yeah, because Steve Rowe did a good thing last night, and I've got to figure out how to do this Zoom because I've got videos locked on there and I can't find them. But anyway, he did a good one last night. And when I thought about today, when I was getting ready for this, because I was preparing to ask you that question, I thought, oh God, what can he really answer? Because I guess Russo is going to be the only thing that he's really got.
That's right.
The strongest thing was going to be Russo's testimony, and I can't think of anything else that's going to be able to put Shaw as Bertrand and involved in the assassination. And I don't know how it went there. Whether I haven't got that far. I hated that had that happen to that man. Everything I've read about him, like you said, is an upstanding citizen. Actually, from what I've read, he's a very interesting man. He wrote plays and loved the arts and
he restored
high society type person.
Yeah, he restored properties in the French Quarter. He wrote plays. He retired early just so he can do that. He had been written about a lot in New Orleans. He was beloved. He won various awards in New Orleans. He had a great life because, you lived in the French Quarter. He had a nice house. He had all his friends there. Puts a crimp in your social life to be charged with killing Kennedy.
Yeah, I'm sure that nobody's going to be hanging out with you or especially being as far away from you. And then even in a situation.
By the way, he tells the story of right after he was charged. He was still invited to a function at the mayor's residence for the city, and the photographers were there, and the mayor was hiding. He didn't want his picture taken with Clay Shaw.
Oh yeah, that doesn't make. I mean, that makes total sense. You don't want to be, put in that, and even, today, and I'm sure back then too. I know people that have been acquitted of murder, then we know that they didn't do it, and there's still always going to be that whisper, hey, that guy did it, he was accused of that murder, and for the rest of his life, even though he was innocent and people knew it, there was always going to be that being said.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story about Edgar Eugene Bradley, who Garrison went after in California. A reporter was looking for, trying to find Edgar Eugene Bradley. He knocked on somebody's door. It was the wrong door. And he said, "Is Edgar Eugene Bradley here?" And the person said, "Oh, the guy who killed Kennedy? Oh, he's down the block."
Oh my God. That kind of reminds me of, I'm sorry, just like political there. It reminded me of when Trump said that about Cruz's father. He's hanging around Lee Harvey Oswald there for a few days. Yeah. Tied him to that. Edward, Gene, you said he knocked on the door, he's down the block. God, they got me. There was something I was wanting to ask you that they got me to thinking about that. It's totally slipped my mind now. I hate that. I can't remember. But yeah, I guess something that always hung him for the rest of his life, and I really just a sad ending to such a great great life up that he lived.
It's whole thing is very sad.
Well, and thank you for what you've done to try to right the wrong that's been done to him by so many in the conspiracy world now that's still taking place. I mean, that's great that you've done that. Hopefully, you will change some minds. I know you won't change them all, but at least you're trying to bring forth that, hey, this guy didn't do it.
One at a time, trying to convert people one at a time to realize he's a horrible person. This guy was.
I think that's a good way to look at it because, like I told you the other day, when I first, I cut my teeth on this. When I watched JFK, I was all convinced, and I was a Garrisonite. I mean, I thought Jim Garrison was the man, and then I kept slowly reading and reading and into this, and the more I learned about the case, and until I met you, I thought you more about the case than probably anybody, and then I meet you, and I'm like on kindergarten level, and you're on college, but then slowly I realized that, man, this guy wasn't guilty. This guy this was one of the biggest sham jobs in the world. So, hopefully somebody else will have an open mind and take it at the evidence that what this man was accused of, and realize that, he was not involved in this in any sort of way. And I'm saying the history still is judging him like that, but I really appreciate what you've done by putting your time in this book. One other question I wanted to have for you, and where you can tell how she really is. John Mellon's book, Farewell to Justice. Is that right? Yes.
Yep. Well, her book is unbelievably horrible. She basically believes every conspiracy story ever told. And so when you read her book, your mind will be just dizzy of suspects, because everything she accepts, every story, every person. And what makes it really, really bad is she accepted the story of Thomas Beckham, who was a con man who came into contact with Garrison in the 60s, and Garrison came to believe that he was a suspect. He was just a con man, a complete con man in every level, and told all these stories to the House Select Committee on Assassinations until they realized just what a con he was. But Joan Mellon believed him, believes everything this guy says, and it's just really her book is really, really, really bad.
And close this thing out. So Garrison, I think it was in 72 72 or 73. He lost to Harry Connick Sr. for re-election. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes.
And then I believe he went on and got elected to a judge at the state level in 78.
He became an appeals court judge.
Okay.
He lost his first attempt to become a judge, and then he won his second try for the appeals court.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he wrote on the Trail of the Assassins in 88 or 89.
Yeah, he had been writing that for many, many years. In the 80s, it was rejected by 16 or 17 publishers. He finally found Sheridan Square Press, who accepted it in the late 80s, and they worked with an editor to rewrite it as a first-person narrative, and it came out, I think, in 88, 89, and then Oliver Stone loved it and bought the rights to it.
Oliver Stone, I believe, if I recall correctly, he was on a plane going somewhere and read the book and fell in love with it. And I'll have to admit, if you want to rate a great fiction mystery, then that was one of the best fiction movie books I've ever read in my life.
Yeah.
And I can even tell you that for some of the people out there watching, he even goes back in the 60s. He called Jack Martin a drunk. By this time this book comes out, he was one of the greatest investigators in history. You can go see the things that he said in the 60s and then put it into the his book, and it's totally changed. Like one part in the book, he says that he was totally surprised when he stopped lighting his pipe and looked up when the prosecutor or the defense called Clay Shaw, and he stops and leaves it at that. Well, somebody asked me in one of the forums, they said, well, it doesn't go any further. And I said, that's because it can't. He wasn't in the courtroom when they called Shaw to the stand. Garrison was not in there. And but yeah, it was a great piece of fiction. I mean, that was the first one I read, and then it was. I'll tell you my first three before I started changing. My first three was On the Trail of the Assassins, Dr. Crenshaw's book Conspiracy of Silence, and Rush to Judgment.
Yeah.
So, but then once I got to, my metamorphosis changed dramatically, and over the years, and I hope others do too.
Yeah, me too.
I think we're
going to have to cut this.
Yeah, I was fixing to close it out. I was going to ask you if you had anything else that you wanted to add to it, Fred.
Well, people can buy my book at www.
Oh yeah, I forgot to tell her to ask that.
So on the
say it again. I interrupted you.
All one word, or on Amazon. It's there. It's a great book, full of documents.
Fred, say it again. I interrupted you when you was in the middle of it.
Yeah, on the trailofdelusion.com, all one word, and you can find details there. I have a great blog. Every day I blog with primary documents on the case, and it's on Amazon and iTunes and you name it. And my book has a lot of primary documents so people can see for themselves some of the documents from the case.
And tell them the name of your other book too.
I was a teenage JFK conspiracy freak.
And I would just like to add one thing too. The blog, I try to catch most of it, but it's a great blog. So it's on the Trail of the Delusions. How's your blog spelled out again? Because I can't remember.
Just go to my website on the trailofdelusion.com and just click on blog.
Oh, okay. Got you. Yeah, because it's a great blog.
My blog. Every day I do a different post with primary documents.
Yeah, it's great. Hey, Fred, I appreciate you giving me this chance again, man. You take care, and let's do New Orleans soon.
Yeah, can't wait. Thank you very much, Chris.
All right, buddy. Thank you, man.
Take care. Yeah, bye.